remembering that I'm streaming this week. Okay. So we ended with the First Crusade. And that actually that did it for chapter 8. As a reminder, the paper is due today, mostly for my online students. Since you're emailing me your paper, please send it as a file attachment, as like a PDF document or a Word document or something, because just sharing it to me through Google Docs or Google Drives or whatever doesn't work. Francis Marion's email doesn't like that, so please send it to me in a way that I can access it immediately. Some people will share the URL, and then I'll click on it and I won't have access. And some people are just like, oh, I shared it. It should have gotten to you. I don't see it at all. I don't have a way to get to that. That's not something that Francis Marion, the Francis Marion email service allows. So just convert it into a file of some kind and attach it. That's all you got to do.
I tried to do my works cited, and can you look and see if I did it right?
I can do that.
Because I got confused, and
Yeah, that's fine.
okay. Because some of them didn't have any information.
MLA, yeah. That to me is the simplest. Just if you're citing things in text, just like put it in parentheses and either the author or the name of the document, because online you don't really have page numbers either. So if you're using a book, use the page number, but otherwise you don't have to worry about that. Something that I've noticed with some of the stuff that people have been sending me, a lot of times when you convert from whatever you guys are using, Word, Google Docs, to PDF, it's hard to make the works cited all on the same page. That's fine. Just have a works cited at the end. That's all I'm worried about. It doesn't have to be. Some people send it to me as a separate document. Don't do that. I'll get confused. Just put it on the end. Just once you're done with the paper, just go down a couple of spaces, put works cited, and then just give me your sources. That's all you got to do. And again, I'll probably mention this again at the end. We're not going to be here Monday. Monday and Tuesday next week we're off, or at least Francis Marion classes are off. I don't know if your other classes will do that, but for me, I'm not going to be here Monday and Tuesday, which will at least mean I'll probably get most of this stuff graded, although I do have a lot of one-on-one online tests to do first. But I will try and get as much graded as possible. If you send it to me via email, your grade will end up on Blackboard. If you handed it to me, I will grade them and hand them back to you. So that's how I do it. Any questions before we start? All right, everybody seems good. In fact, this chapter is where I will pull the default topic for the second paper from, since we are now a month out from the end of the semester. So yeah, I'll just discuss more of that near the end, so we'll be a little bit more into the chapter before we talk about it. But yeah, so let's start the Gothic High Middle Ages. This is the period of the Middle Ages that most people think about because things are more organized. Things are actually going pretty well. This in particular is why a lot of historians don't like the term the Dark Ages, because a lot of the Middle Ages were actually pretty good for people. It's when we get to the next chapter when the bubonic plague hits and famine and the 100 Years' War that things get really bad. And it's because of that that, like, right after that is when the Renaissance happens, and they look back as like, oh, everything was dark and terrible. It's like, everything was dark and terrible just before you guys, but that whole period wasn't as bad. So, let's get into this. As a reminder, the next test will be 4 chapters. It'll be 7, 8, 9, and 10, because they're all Middle Ages chapters. So while this is chapter 9 and technically the third since we had the previous test, the test isn't going to be after this chapter. So we got one more. So the old way of learning was within the monasteries, focused around spiritual ideals, highly localized. Again, this is really where your reading was at. If you wanted to learn to read, you pretty much had to join a monastery. And let's see. Yeah, learning was not keeping up with the changes in the medieval world. Monasteries in the early Middle Ages and even the Romanesque Central Middle Ages, the Middle Middle Ages, as I like to say, the monasteries were like the center of education, and especially in the early Middle Ages were like the only place where reading still existed. However, as the medieval world is growing and changing, they're actually getting left behind. So this led to cathedral schools, a period of about 100 years, where towns would basically form around these cathedrals, and students from far and wide would come together to work with the famous masters who taught there. The teaching methods here were the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and then the quadrivium, math, geometry, astronomy, and music. So you had what was basically like your, not really philosophy, but learning to speak and read and write and think critically. And then the quadrivium was more science-based. I mean, yeah, music too, but technically, especially at the time, music was like very, was very theory. I mean, there is math to music, and in particular, they were like teaching that. I mean, there's even genres of music that are like heavily math-based in how the music's done, and it's pretty interesting. There was one. I've probably only heard one song of this genre, but it's like math metal, and the way that the music is formatted, or I don't know music words, but like the rhythm and stuff is on like a specific mathematics scale. It's a thing. It exists. John of Salisbury is one of the main guys from this period. He was a humanist. And a humanist at this time was those that were interested in the classics and human affairs, so basically a historian. Looked to logic and reason to explain the way the world worked. And this wasn't like what we'd see much later with the Enlightenment, because it was still like seeing logic and reason to explain why things work in the way that God made them. Like there was no question of like, oh no, we can do things without. It's like, no, God made all this stuff, we were going to figure out how it works. And really that was even the way the Enlightenment was, but it was seen as going too far for a lot of the church. So here we have the cathedral schools. I mean, you just go in and you get taught by the various masters that are hanging out there. And at the end of the chapter, spoiler, we move from cathedral schools to just straight up universities. Universities come about during this time period. So we bookend this chapter with the move from monasteries to cathedral schools, and then by the end of the chapter, the cathedral schools can't even keep up. So there is such a growth of knowledge and learning in this time period, which is really cool for a time period called the Dark Ages. Yeah, the the documentary that I've linked a couple of times on the website, on Blackboard, it's technically accurate, but a lot of the rhetoric of it is, oh, the times were terrible and everything was bad and, nobody knew anything. They're exaggerating for the sake of, having a dramatic show on the History Channel. Things weren't that bad. Until they were, in which case that's the next chapter. Things were very bad in the late Middle Ages. Speaking of the Gothic High Middle Ages, Gothic architecture. So we had Abbot Suger, became the abbot of Saint, I guess that's Denis because it's French. This was a monastery outside of Paris where they buried the kings of France. So this is a very important monastery. He wanted to increase the prominence of this place and basically make a big fancy church to express how magnificent and important this place was. Because, we had a place, we had Aachen, in near Vienna, that was, Charlemagne's capital. Well, he wanted to do basically the same thing here. He began collecting lands and funds, promoting King Louis VI, also known as Louis the Fat. There are stories from this time period that Louis was so big he couldn't get up on a horse himself, so they had to use the medieval version of a crane to get him up there, which I would say poor horse, but their horses were huge back then too. Like you see Clydesdales today, that was the norm in Europe around this time. Modern horses are typically much smaller and bred for speed, as opposed to the massive horses they had back then, which were mostly for, carrying armored soldiers into war. So he wanted to rebuild areas of the church, and he was very, very micromanaging about it. He oversaw the stone being quarried, the harvesting of trees to be used as, supports. So every little thing he made sure was right before he even got to the church. So the stonemasons introduced new types of architecture, buttresses, pointed arches, which allowed for the church to be larger or taller, and also to, let in more light. Buttresses are a hell of a thing in that, they're these outside structures, and they look just like decoration, but they actually support a lot of the weight of the walls so that you can build higher. I've obviously got images here in just a second. And also, due to this focusing so much weight on, outer sections, the inner walls were able to be basically taken out in many places and have these big windows. So you got stained glass windows, which allowed in a bunch of light. So really, the ideal was, and especially as we get further along, because I'll just go ahead and show it. This cathedral, while it is really fancy, is nothing compared to what we'd see with later cathedrals. But this was the start. You have the buttresses here, these big outside structures that relieve support from the walls. The pointed arches, which again are very good at holding the weight. And it allowed for these big open areas for them to put in stained glass. So when you walk in, obviously today they have electric lights. Back then they'd have, torches and stuff. But for the most part, there would not be any light sources inside the church because you'd have sunlight, or even just daylight coming in through the windows. Not only were they pretty, but it would actually cast different colored lights along the floor. And it basically made it feel like you were in the presence of, if not God, at least, heavenly, the heavenly host, as it were. Because, again, look how little the people are, and there's these massive structures. Again, the arches are more pointed, so there's more weight being put within the arch so that they could do more with the outside. Again, they've got these naves off to the side that you would often have my brain just shut off, the altars to the various saints, so you walk around the outside, and then of course these huge columns. This is not Saint Denis. I believe this is Chartres Cathedral in Paris, which is known as Notre Dame, but it's actually called the Chartres Cathedral. It's just this massive open space, I mean mostly open, of wall that they've got all this beautiful stained glass in. I mean, look at all that purple. And oftentimes, like if you go around and actually look at the images, they're the various saints, or sometimes if it's smaller, it's like the Stations of the Cross as you go around. It was more than just look at the pretty stuff, but there's so much actual like specific art in here. It's really neat. There's Chartres Cathedral before it burned down recently. Obviously, they've got a ton of money, so I think it's back in working order. This was not technically the largest of these Gothic cathedrals, but it's certainly the most well-known. And again, you've got, by this point they had flying buttresses, which were even farther off the walls, which further added to the way it looked, but also supported so much weight. I mean, look how little these people are. And this was done in the Middle Ages. Oops. There's more interior, more of the height of the building. And look at these. I mean, it looks like how modern day skyscrapers are, all glass on the outside. There's just so much open area here, because all this is, this isn't support stuff. You've got little supports here just to keep the stuff together, but there's just so much open space because of what they were able to do with the arches. This is the one that's in Chartres Cathedral. This is the very, very famous rose window. You've got the station, no, not the Station of the Cross. These are the various disciples. I think you got Station of the Cross in here. No, these are the disciples. That's Stations of the Cross. Various rulers and whatnot. I know this one especially because when I was back in college, my girlfriend at the time there was some kind of thing they were doing in art class, and you would, for extra credit, you had to recreate a piece of art in sidewalk chalk on the sidewalk behind behind the art department. If you've ever been to If you've ever been to Francis Marion, to the campus and been to the art department, there's this huge just slab of concrete behind the building, and then also this sidewalk that goes further into the parking lot. Just big open concrete, and she did this. It looked like she had been working in a coal mine, because she actually did take black chalk and make all of this, the dark on the inside here. So there was black chalk everywhere. And then of course, the specific details of the other bits. All right. So with all these changes happening, some people went beyond what, we're quite a few pages in now, went beyond what the church what the church saw as acceptable. There were three major trials against intellectuals, all that were overseen by Bernard of Clairvaux. Again, since this is 4 chapters, I don't think Bernard is on the test that I recall. But still, what he was up to was important. He was part of the Cistercian movement. They wanted a simpler life, avoiding the entrapments of materialistic medieval society, condemned even the decorations of the Romanesque churches, which we saw last chapter, which were pretty fancy, but nothing like the Gothic cathedrals. They saw these extra frills as being a distraction from, contemplating God and whatnot, which is the opposite of what the cathedrals were actually trying to do, and that they were trying to, inspire people and put them in a sense of awe. But, not everybody agrees. He was an influential orator. The Pope had him call for a second crusade, and since people followed this guy, he was able to, use his influence to call for a second crusade. However, the Second Crusade was an absolute disaster. As we mentioned at the end of last chapter, the First Crusade got to the Holy Land, and they ended with the capture of Jerusalem. That was the only crusade that was ever successful, and there was like 9. This Second Crusade, before even getting to Constantinople, which is usually where they set off to start into the Holy Land, they went up to Germany and massacred a bunch of Jews, because that was how things often went. In fact, before the First Crusade, there was a massacre, multiple massacres of Jews, because they're not Christian, therefore they're bad. And also the church was pushing the idea of it was the Jews that killed Jesus, not the Roman authorities, even though they were the ones in power, but whatever. Which is an argument used in a lot of anti-Semitism, even today. And once the crusade did actually start moving towards Constantinople, they never actually made it there. There were a bunch of royal leaders, England, France, Spain, etc., and their rivalries caused them to just break up the crusade and go home before they even got to where they were going. This is going to be a common theme. The First Crusade, everybody was eager and ready and going together to take Jerusalem from the Muslims and massacre like 10,000 within the church alone. But here, I guess with Europe becoming more stable, the various kingdoms are becoming more powerful, and therefore they're more concerned about their own skin rather than like what the church says they should do. So here's Bernard of Clairvaux. There are those who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge, that is curiosity. Those who seek knowledge to be known by others, that is vanity. And those who seek knowledge in order to serve, that is love. So despite his questionable opinions on some stuff, this isn't a bad way of doing things. So on to the Third Crusade. So I don't know why they even called for a Second Crusade, because it wasn't until about this period that there was a major upset within the Holy Land. I guess the Pope's just like, hey, we need a bunch of people to go murder Muslims again. So after the First Crusade, the Crusaders who remained within Jerusalem and various Crusader states were mostly getting along with the Muslims there. They were coexisting. Many of them actually saw how, for lack of a better word, advanced the Muslim people were. They had a lot of math and sciences that that Western Europe hadn't gotten to yet, and especially astronomy. They were like really into tracking the stars and the planets and whatnot, and that takes a lot of math by itself. However, by 1187, the Islamic world was taken by storm by a man known as Saladin. So this was like a redo of the Islamic Turks, or the Seljuk Turks, I should say, who were more aggressive. After being defeated by the First Crusade, it took Saladin to push things back. So Saladin retook Jerusalem, which caused the Third Crusade, because, hey, we can't have that. We got to go and take Jerusalem back. This didn't go so well. So, in the Third Crusade, the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, who we'll actually talk about later, so, again, we're doing things thematically, his army was destroyed, and on the way back, he drowned trying to ford a river, because getting across rivers wasn't always, very safe. We also have Richard the Lionheart, a very famous leader from this period. He was the King of England, and working with Philip II Augustus, who was the King of France, they managed to retake Acre and Jaffa, but because they were the kings of England and France respectively, they couldn't get along. Eventually, Philip went home and attacked Richard's holdings, which is to say the lands of Normandy, because technically Richard's family is from Normandy. So Richard abandoned the crusade to go back to protect his lands from the guy that was supposedly his ally, and ended up being captured by an Austrian duke and held for ransom by the next Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. So, yeah, so much for all of Europe getting together to fight, the Muslims in the Middle East. We've got a lot of the European leaders fighting each other. Actually, I'll go ahead and discuss this. So I assume everybody here is familiar with the tales of Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor and all of that. And the issue was that the king, the leader, Prince John, he was never really considered the king, was raising taxes all across England, and it was, causing great hardship for the people. And most of the people that Robin Hood supposedly attacked were tax collectors. He would take money that they had taken and redisperse it among the people. Obviously, Robin Hood, the individual, didn't exist, but there were a lot of people who did what Robin Hood does in the stories. There were a lot of people who fought back against the tax collectors and redistributed the money back to the poor folks. Robin Hood is just like a single character that encapsulated that entire period of unrest. However, there was a reason that Prince John was collecting a bunch of taxes from the people, and it wasn't because he was just some jerk. Richard the Lionheart had been captured and was being held for ransom. He had to collect a bunch of money to get his brother out of, essentially, jail. And if you watch like any Robin Hood movies, even literally Men in Tights, it ends with Richard comes back and everybody's happy because John is no longer in power and everything's good again. The reason everything's good again is not because Richard was a particularly good ruler. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But they weren't collecting taxes anymore because the guy that they were collecting taxes for is now back. So, in the Robin Hood stories, Prince John's the bad guy, King Richard's the good guy. In reality, Prince John was collecting money because his idiot brother had gotten captured. So, I like to talk about that in this period because, everybody knows about Robin Hood. Well, it was a thing that happened, but it wasn't because Richard was this great guy and his evil brother was taken over. I'm not going to pretend that Prince John was necessarily a good guy. He was probably a jerk and was probably using some of the money for himself. But for the most part, this was to get his brother out of jail. This is a very popular depiction of Henry the Lionheart. This is, of course, the national treasure. Well, not national, he's not our guy. This is Sean Connery, of course, as King Richard. to me, this is the best depiction of King Richard ever. It's just this guy. Yeah, we'll get to more about Henry later, because there's a bunch I want to say now, but it's like that's literally in the notes later. I need to stop myself. Pope Innocent II, third. I can read Roman numerals. So we talked about Pope Gregory the Great last time, and how he used the power of excommunication to basically force the various kingdoms in Europe to obey the Pope. Well, Pope Innocent III, while for some reason he's not known as Pope Innocent the Great, he was probably the most powerful pope. He, due to the investiture controversy, which is another thing with like people giving power to, or trying to create their own bishops, which would then be beholden to the government authorities as opposed to beholden to the church. This made it so that the church had basically complete power. I've also mentioned this last time. Nobles would often buy church offices so that they could basically have the job of some church high official and not actually do the work. Pluralism was that taken to its logical extreme, in that you would have purchased multiple jobs in multiple churches, but obviously you can only be at one, especially at a time when like travel over land was very, very difficult. But you'd be getting paid for all of them while only being at one, and very rarely actually doing the job of the one either. So this led to 1208. Pope Innocent and King John of England disagreed on the Archbishop of Canterbury. England was placed under interdict, which essentially cut them off from the traditional like Catholic rites of sacraments and whatnot, where you were only given the sacraments if you were dying or in danger of dying. In the Catholic faith, you have to receive sacraments in order for your soul to 100% definitely be pure enough to go to heaven once you die. It's different from most modern, Protestant things where you accept Jesus and you're done. Here, it's like you had to basically refresh, because you're a sinner and your soul's going to get dirty no matter how good of a Catholic you are. So you have to continue being a good Catholic. So John took church properties by force, which is something we'll actually see later as well, to make money. So the Pope excommunicated him. Now, we saw that briefly last time with, I think it was Henry IV of France was excommunicated, which meant that he was no longer under the protection of the church, which further meant no Christian had any reason to obey him. He was still the king, but according to the Pope, and therefore society at large, he was illegitimate, and if you overthrew him, then it wouldn't be a problem. And also, if you were an outside nation and you invaded his nation, that wasn't a problem, even though technically you're invading a Christian nation, but the leader is excommunicated, so he doesn't count. This went further in that Pope Innocent directly invaded the King of France to invade England. And unlike with Gregory the Great, the king wasn't able to grovel to the Pope and be forgiven. Pope Innocent forced John to surrender his kingdom, which is to say England, to Pope Innocent and receive it back as a fief. Now, this is all ceremonial and symbolic. You know, technically the Catholic Church isn't ruling over England, but symbolically, the King of England had been so thoroughly humiliated that he had to have his own kingdom given back to him as a fief, which means that he was technically on paper a vassal of the Pope. Because he screwed up and got excommunicated, and the Pope decided he couldn't be forgiven until he completely surrendered his whole everything to the papacy. Because they could do that. Because the Pope could just do that with excommunication within the system is extremely dangerous. I like to compare it to when you say watch old westerns and they say, oh yeah, so-and-so they're an outlaw. And that's said so much now it's kind of lost meaning. But what an outlaw meant was that you were no longer recognized by the law. So if you walk into town and some dude shoots you in the middle of the road, that guy's not going to get in trouble because you are an outlaw and are no longer protected by the law. So if you're excommunicated, you're no longer protected by the church, and the church was pretty much in control of all of England, all of Europe. For some reason, I mixed those two up in my head. So this was a big deal. We saw with the Papal Schism, the East and West excommunicated each other, but that didn't really mean anything because it's like, oh, we're being excommunicated by Constantinople. That didn't matter. Unless one side completely took over the other, it was symbolic. But this was a big deal. King John had to grovel before the Pope's legate, not even going to the Pope, and symbolically hand over his kingdom to the papacy. Yeah, Pope Innocent was crazy powerful. So on to the Fourth Crusade. Pope Innocent still ruling over basically all of Europe, sent his legates to Constantinople to try to end the Great Schism. Because, hey, I mean, we're all Christians, right? We should all get along. However, once again, it wasn't just let's all get along, it's you guys should obey us. You guys should follow our way of doing things. To the point that he threatened a forcible solution to the disunity of the church. He was threatening to have basically all of Europe invade Constantinople. While this was going on, he was getting together another crusade to go to the Holy Land. So this crusade wasn't actually part of his threat against Constantinople, but it does show that there is a lot of animosity there. The Doge, or chief official of Venice, was also working to get this crusade together because crusades were expensive. I mean, you were getting a bunch of dudes, make sure they had weapons and armor. I mean, obviously they had to buy their own, but it was still an expensive process. And then transporting them all the way across Europe to modern-day, Turkey, Istanbul, and then down into the Middle East. So in 1195, Alexius, who claimed ownership of the throne of Constantinople, which means that he wasn't the one actually in power, but he believed he should be, promised to pay off the debts that Venice had given the crusade, because again, Venice had all of the money. He said that he would pay off the debts, give the Crusaders money to go down to Egypt, and also reunite the East and West. All the Crusaders had to do was come to Constantinople and basically help him take it by force. So in 1203, the Crusaders made their way to Constantinople. They chased out the old emperor. However, Alexius did not have the money and power he claimed he did. Actually, I'm going to read this one from the book. When the newly installed Emperor Alexius and his father could not find the funds to satisfy the assembled attackers, they were deposed and Alexius was strangled to death. At the urging of the Doge of Venice, the Crusaders continued the attack on Constantinople. 2 ships financed by Latin bishops took 2 of the city's towers. A week later, Constantinople fell to the wayward Western Crusaders. For 3 days, they ran riot, burning, and looting. Many of the precious objects that Constantine and the Romans had transferred were seized and sent west. Among them, the 4 ancient copper horses that were mounted on St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. So the Fourth Crusade, which was meant to go to Constantinople, it's not Istanbul yet, and then help them take land back from the Muslims, ended up basically burning Constantinople down. I guess you could call this the worst crusade, because while some of them didn't even make it to the Middle East, this one actually attacked the city they were supposed to be helping. So I'd say that's definitely a negative. So here's the attack on Constantinople. It's one of the images of this period where things are so busy it's hard to even tell what's going on. There's way too many boats in the water at the same time. But it does just give an idea of how chaotic it was. All right. So on to better things happening in this period. And FYI, this is kind of where the information for the default topic for the second paper starts. Because, well, if you have the book, which I don't think too many people do, on page 273, there's this little section, high watermark for the Middle Ages. Basically, for the default topic, and I'll mention this again at the end because I don't know how well my online students watch the whole class. For the default topic, go through and mostly this chapter, decide what part of the Middle Ages that you consider to be like the most positive. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret that. For example, in 1215 is when the where is it at? The Magna Carta was signed. We'll get to that in just a little bit, which was like a major step towards to a more representative government in England. Even the Crusades could be seen as somewhat positive because it's showing that, to a degree, the Europeans could be united. Here we'll talk about how things are actually doing better economically. That's difficult to write as a single topic, but yeah, that's the default topic is just what part of the Middle Ages is most interesting to you in terms of like it being positive. A lot of people write on certain rulers. I get a lot of Richard the Lionheart or his wife. Oh shoot! Oh no, not his wife. Oh yeah, his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was real big in this period. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff you could write on, just as the default. Beyond that, anything from what we did the last one was in Greece. So like anything from Alexander the Great to literally the Renaissance. Lot of stuff you can do. Lots of information in this period. Anyway, again, agriculture was the main base of the economy, and wilderness was being cleared away to create more land to farm. This was especially good in France because, well, they had a lot of land and a lot of it was really good for growing food. The population grew to about 20 million, which in the Middle Ages was insane, particularly in northern France. We mentioned last time the medieval warm period was this period of warmer temperatures, to the point that England could grow, had vineyards, could make wine, which of course pissed off France. And it actually warmed things up so much that northern France was better for growing than southern France. Today, southern France is still like this breadbasket of really all of Europe. It's this beautiful, there's the weather there is wonderful. You can grow stuff there almost all year round because it's right there on the Mediterranean. But things actually got so warm in the medieval warm period, it was almost too warm in the south, and the northern parts of France were better for growing stuff, which, again, going there today is kind of crazy because northern France is much more cool and rainy due to its, how close it is to England. All was not well, though, because despite the fact that the population was growing, the standard of living was not, especially with peasants. So as nobles saw the population growing, they're like, hey, we can get more money from these people and increase taxes, land taxes and whatnot. And it led to quite a few peasant revolts. And normally when we talk about like revolts and uprisings, it usually isn't too bad. When we're talking, when we talk about American stuff, European peasant revolts were crazy because it was like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of peasants rising up against the nobility, burning manors, and as we're going to see later, literally roasting the nobles alive. Yeah, you don't want a peasant revolt because there's a lot of peasants, and they're all pissed. And typically, if you've been farming your entire life, you're going to be pretty fit. And even if you don't have like swords, you still have sharp implements. You've still got farm tools. And while it's not a sword, taking a pickaxe to the face is usually not a good for your health. Once again, with the population growing, we started seeing urban centers again. We mentioned that briefly at the end of the last chapter, but here they are growing significantly. Paris reached upwards about 100,000 people in 1300. And kings liked the idea of towns because technically they were not under the control of the nobles. The vassals of the king were given land in the countryside to administer and whatever. So a town or a city was technically not part of that. And if they were, it was pretty easy to force the noble to relinquish rulership over that. So obviously, if you're in a town or city, you still need the villages out in the countryside for food. But pretty quickly, these towns became centers of trade, which we hadn't seen since, the fall of Rome. Developed extensive trade networks all around the medieval world, mostly over sea routes. That the book here has a map of trade routes, and there are a few through the land, overland, but they were much more rare than going by boat. So here we have the cottage industry, which is something we usually don't talk about until the early Industrial Revolution. But it was a thing that had been around forever. So originally there were these little in-home networks of collecting, processing, and producing finished goods. Basically, a merchant would come to a village and supply the people with, say, wool. And over usually days, if not weeks or months, they would gradually spin the wool into thread and sometimes even make it into cloth. And then the merchant would come back and buy it back, obviously at a pretty low price so he could go and sell it later for a profit. But it was more money than the people were making farming. So it was a good little way to make extra money. However, as the towns grew, these larger enterprises were often set up, and it wasn't quite what we would see in the Industrial Revolution, but it was a form of that, where rather than having, women in a family working on the spinning wheel in their spare time, they actually would bring people into like a building with a bunch of these tools where they would work together throughout the day to produce thread and cloth and to the point of clothes, which is actually a pattern we'll see once again in the Industrial Revolution, where it starts out in cottage industries and they bring it all into these big factories. So this is the medieval version of that, I guess. So here's your typical medieval town. You've got your roads and your defensive wall, and of course they're right here on a river because you need flowing water. In the case of, say, Paris, the river ran actually through the middle of the city. Guilds, something else that we briefly mention in American history. Guilds were a major part of how the European powers, maintained the industry that they had. So they set up what were essentially, I guess, almost like labor unions. They set up associations of craftsmen to control production. So what this meant was that if you went into a town and you wanted to, say, buy shoes or buy a barrel or anything that would be made by craftsmen, you had to go through the guild. If you were coming to a town to set up a shop to make these things, you had to go through the guild or they'd break your legs. You didn't mess with the guilds. So what this resulted in was basically a monopoly. They would set prices, control production. You had a hierarchy of masters and apprentices, so, the guys who ran the thing, and then oftentimes below them were the journeymen who actually did most of the work. And then below them were apprentices, which were typically kids that were basically adopted into the guild master's family and worked for no pay and often did just grunt work. You'd sweep out the shop or go and get beer for everybody. But you would gradually learn the trade while living with the master, and then once you became a journeyman, you could actually start making money. But this did completely block out any kind of competition. You couldn't come and decide, oh, I'm going to make shoes, but I'm going to make them for lower prices. They would burn your shop down, possibly with you in it. But what this did mean was that, let's see, what this did mean was that the goods that were produced in a town were also of a very strict quality. So while you couldn't go in and set up your own shop to make less expensive items, it at least meant that if you went to a town and needed to buy something, it would be of a pretty good quality. Because people would let the guilds happen, because while they, again, made a monopoly, they at least ensured that the stuff that you were buying wasn't garbage. typically, when you have a monopoly, when you have a lack of competition, they won't worry about quality because they're the only game in town. But they knew that if they made garbage products, the people would run them out. So the guild system spread among really all of medieval society. So it wasn't just used for crafts. Professional groups set up guilds. Italian city-states had guilds of notaries, so legal documents, bankers, that sort of thing. Merchants and universities also would set this up. So what we'd see later with universities of, you have the one master, which is to say, the professor, the teacher, and then the apprentices as the students, in a very similar way of doing stuff. All right. A very similar way of hierarchy. Also, all those trade routes we talked about were typically due to the guilds because they were the ones with all the money, and oftentimes they had a lot of political power in the cities as well. As I mentioned, travel over land was garbage. It was very slow, very dangerous because, well, there were bandits. And most roads were just like clearings. Just, hey, here's a path that doesn't have trees in it. I guess this is the road. Very few had any kind of paving, and even that would be like, I was going to say gravel, but not even that. I've seen how gravel roads are made, and there is more to it than just dumping rocks along a road. Sometimes they would have like planks over parts of the road that when it rained would just become underwater. But obviously that would rot before too long and they'd have to replace it, and that costs money, and a lot of times they didn't feel like spending money on that. So for the most part, when it came to trade, it was the port cities. You would go in and how where the ships came in, and that's where the goods were from. Excuse me. Also mentioned in this section is the idea of usury. This is charging interest on loans, so that if you loan someone money, or especially like a company money, there was a way that you could make some of that money back. This was prohibited by the Catholic Church, which would make it so that banks would hardly be able to operate. But, well, I'll see if y'all know. So especially in this time period, and even today, like when people are like, oh, the international bankers, they're talking about a specific group. Typically, they're talking about Jews. Because at this time, most of the bankers were Jews. Why? Can you guess why that is the why that would be the case? I mean, this is obviously a clue.
Because you're supposed to, in the Bible, Jews were supposed to pay back what they owed, and
Well, that was part of it, but another part was this: it was prohibited by the church, the Catholic Church.
they hate them.
Well, that was a part of it, but Jews were not beholden to the Catholic Church. If you're not a Catholic, you don't have to follow the Catholic rules. So Jews obviously followed the old, Mosaic law, and they typically had their own society, within these cities. So they were allowed to be bankers who charged interest on loans, because technically they weren't under the authority of the church. Obviously, they were still hated. It's like, oh, they're doing this because they're greedy. But it's like, if you're going to be a banker, you can't just stand there and hold someone's money until they want it back. You're not gonna be able to survive. So the only way loans worked was for people to charge interest on them, and while the church technically prohibited it, if you weren't part of the church, you could do that. So Jews were literally needed to be bankers, otherwise it wouldn't work. So it was like a loophole. Also, most jobs were closed off to Jews because, again, they hated them. So they were sort of forced into the role of like bankers and money lenders, that sort of thing. So here we have a not terribly accurate medieval market. I mean, obviously, everything's way too colorful. Otherwise, they're all really rich. And I don't think towers got quite that pointy. But, I mean, this is still a decent idea of, your medieval market. There was still a lot going on. I mean, you've even got, like, children had toys, cloth being traded, just all sorts of stuff. If you've ever been to the Renaissance Fair up in Charlotte, or up near Charlotte, it's all very lively like this. All right, let's get a little further. Oh, perfect. This is the last section before the next big heading, so we will end with this. There's also the issue of tolls. Typically, since, as we mentioned, the nobility had no control over the towns, they would put up tolls in roads and bridges that they controlled so that when merchants came through to, sell or buy from a town, the nobles could actually get some of that money. Obviously, the people in the town didn't like that, because if a merchant has come through a bunch of tolls and gets to town and he doesn't have any money to buy anything, he's not helping the economy in the town. So it set the towns against the countryside, and depending on where you were, one side or the other would have more power and either be able to force the tolls to stop, or you go through and there'd be a lot of tolls because the nobles have more power than the towns. So we had the idea of a commune where, a bunch of people living and working together without any real specific leadership. This began in the city of Leon, where the residents came together against an oppressive bishop. I'm just going to go ahead and read this one out of the book. Burghers, merchants, priests of the town bridled under the arbitrary rule of their bishop and local nobles, who imposed arbitrary taxes and subjected them to indignities. I don't actually know what happened in this town, but being subjected to indignities is often code for a lot of bad stuff. Even the king, when he visited his royal towns, was forced to pay various fees. They formed a commune, to which first the bishop agreed. When he finally dissolved the bonds of the association and broke his previous promises, the shopkeepers closed their shops, fearing the bishop and nobles would plunder their goods. Some of the angered townsmen conspired to murder the bishop. When he went to church on Sunday, one of them, thinking it was time to begin the riot, began to chant commune, commune. The riot lasted for days. That's a single sentence. The riot lasted for days. The conspirators murdered the bishop, hacking off his legs and leaving his corpse to rot in the street, where it was rescued by this other bishop. Other aristocrats and associates of the prelate tried to flee, but many were hunted down and murdered by the mob. These the folks in the towns were really starting to form this sense of unity, and were very, very much against being messed with by people from the outside. There were less murderous communes in other towns to try to govern themselves and resist local nobles, which again the king often would support, because if the nobles are being weakened by really a third party, an outside force that wasn't the king, it meant that the king technically had more power. It's all about balance between the nobility and the monarchy. And villages became more agriculturally dependent than in the early Middle Ages due to the towns taking over the cottage industries we'd seen before. So before, villages did mostly agriculture, but they also had the cottage industry where they could do a little bit of, industry. But since the towns were taking it into a more central location, the villages really became even more dependent on their agriculture. Which seems like a step backward, but I mean, it's really just like I consider it a lateral step. It's not necessarily worse, but it's the villages themselves aren't progressing like the towns are. If you wanted to go somewhere where things were changing and new, you had to leave the village and go to a town, which I think we'll also talk about in a little bit. I mean, obviously not today, but Cathedral Scrolls. Oh, I guess it'll be next chapter because this is right near the end. All right. Yeah, that's the first part of chapter 9. We'll probably actually be able to finish it next time. But as a reminder, we're not going to be here Monday and Tuesday. So we'll finish it. We'll do it next Wednesday. That's all I got. So until next Wednesday, I'll see you guys then. And why is it red? Is it going dead? Well, that's fine. As long as it's working. Let me make sure it's working. Working? Yes. All right.